In this short video, we're going to be looking at the strategic planning models, and we're going to be focusing specifically on the rational model and all its component parts and see how they actually fit in. And you will see there's a lot of elements which have been taken from other areas that you've already covered, so you should be able to associate with this model. So if we look at this model, we can see the different component parts, which includes the mission statement, and then the next section is the position, which includes the internal appraisal, stakeholder appraisal, external appraisal. Then the next section, which is the choice, which includes the objectives, the strategic options, strategic choice, and then the next section, which are actions, which includes the implementation of your strategic choice. So if we take the first element, which is the mission, well, the mission statement is defined as an action-based statement that declares the purpose of an organization and how they serve their customers. So if we take the mission statement for British Airways is a global airline bringing people, places and diverse cultures together for more than over 100 years. So what is the mission, the vision and the aims and objectives of your organization? Because that's also going to play a very important part in terms of the direction of the company. The next element, moving on to the position, is going to be really determining the internal appraisal of the organization and focusing on the strengths and weaknesses of the organization. And the strengths and weaknesses, what are they doing right in terms of their processes and their practices? How efficient are they? And how are they compared to their other rivals in the same industry sector in terms of their gross profit percentage margins, their net profit percentage margins? Are they doing just as well or not? Or do they need to improve in certain areas? They may be making a healthy net profit, but in comparison to other competitors in that same industry, are they above or below them? Because if they're below, then changes need to be made within the organization to make sure that they're in line with the competitors or the average industry standards. Likewise, what are their strengths and weaknesses in terms of cash flow? We've seen today that one of the biggest problems of businesses coming out of the pandemic is cash flow. And yes, they may be a successful business before the pandemic, but do they have enough money and enough cash to survive the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic? And lots of businesses don't. And especially now that there is high inflation, we've got higher and raised interest rates. So, the possibility of lower growth in the UK, the possibility of the UK going into recession. We're not technically in a recession at the moment because that is defined by 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. So, and how is the company, positioned in terms of their cash flow and their current ratios and their asset tests to be able to survive a period of time of slow growth. If we look at stakeholder appraisal, one would need to look at obviously the internal and the external stakeholders. But in addition to looking at the internal and external and the degree of importance of specific stakeholders, also assessing what is the stakeholder engagement policy and effectiveness of the organization. What is the effectiveness of the stakeholder management within the organization? And so how well are the stakeholders being handled? If we look at the external appraisals, we could use other models that you've looked at before, including Pestel, taking into consideration the political, economic, social, technological, legal and environmental factors and how these are affecting companies now. If we look at the economic side in terms of high inflation rates, high interest rates, and soon the possibility of going into a recession for the UK. The UK is not performing as well as other European countries. And so, how is that going to affect businesses? Likewise, the legal side in terms of Brexit and the political side in terms of Brexit. How has that affected the UK in terms of specific employment of workers and key workers, in terms of trade between their biggest European market right next door? And also looking at the external parts of SWOT in terms of the opportunities and threats, and then taking into consideration Porter's five forces in terms of the competitiveness of the environment. Who are the competitors, and what market shares do they have? You know, who has the power, bargaining power of suppliers, or who has the power in terms of the customers? What about substitute products and market entry? How effective or how easy is it for other competitors to enter into the same marketplace? So all these things give you a position in terms of what to look at. Now we kind of move on to the objectives in terms of the choice. And we might want to think in terms of, before we move on to the objectives, we have to see what type of business is your business in that company. Are you a prospector in terms of developing and creating new products and ideas, or are you considered to be a defender, protecting its current markets? Are you a analyzer, which kind of maintains its current market share but also acts like a prospector in terms of developing new ideas and products? Or are you a reactor, so really no consistent strategic approach, but kind of drifting along and moving along with environmental considerations? And then you need to consider, in terms of the company philosophy, are you a domestic orientated company? Are you a multi-domestic orientated company? And are you a global orientated company? Because these are going to affect your strategic options in terms of what you want to do, where you want to allocate your resources. So if you're like Apple, where you see the whole world as a global marketplace, and you see all the consumers as being one and the same with similar needs. So it really depends on terms of the philosophy and the organizational kind of view in terms of where they want to go as well. If you look at the strategic options, and here now we've covered various models before, and these kind of models you're going to bring in to give you, kind of like direction. If you've got a wide product range like Samsung, so you might use the BCG matrix in terms of putting product categories into the cash cows, the question marks, the stars and the dogs. So where are these groups, and which groups do you want to get rid of because they're not very successful? So if we look at the Samsung smartwatches, well, they haven't been successful in terms of competing against Apple's. So they've actually been moved into a dog and then discontinued. If we look at the 360-degree cameras now, when Samsung first, launched their 360-degree cameras, but you can't see them now in their stores, and their staff don't even know what these things are because they've been discontinued. If you take into consideration the ANSOP model in terms of market development, diversification, market penetration, and product development, and even Porter's generic strategies in terms of cost leadership or differentiation, and then a cost focus strategy or differentiation focused strategy. So what do you want to go for, and in what product ranges, and in which markets? So these will be all the strategic options, but they will be in line with your organizational view and philosophy in terms of where the company wants to go. Then if we look at the strategic choice, well, the strategic choice is determining what you want to do, and then that's going to obviously lead into your marketing strategy for your range of products or services in terms of your segmentation, your targeting, and your positioning. And it's then going to link into your use of your marketing mix, either the 7 or the 4 Ps. This then leads into your implementation, and your implementation is to carry out your marketing strategy and the implementation of your marketing mix. And then you have your strategy in terms of what you want to achieve, and how well is it being controlled, how well is it being achieved. And this will link back to what's happening in the environmental concerns, like we might be going into recession, so this might having have an adverse effect on your long-term plans. And this might even go back to your mission and your vision, your aims and objectives, what's happening. And we see, for instance, in the external environment, in terms of technological environment, we see AI, the development of AI, which is having a big impact on businesses. And how does this then feed back to affect your objectives, your strategic options, and your strategic choice, and then your implementation? So all of these things kind of like root and keep going back and forward. So if we look at the strategic planning and the rationale model, then we're saying strategic plans and changing depending upon a situational analysis, and a strategy small extensions of past policies. And after implementation, you must monitor and control and continually see what's happening in the internal and external environment of your company, which could then change what your company is doing in terms of your objectives and your policies and your strategy and so on and so forth. So I hope this has helped today.